So I realized in recording the videos for section 18.1 that I produced about 20 minutes of material for one section of one chapter, and you'll be doing multiple chapters in a week. And so that level of detail from me is just not really possible to make this a good experience for you. And so I apologize, but from here on out, I'm going to be summarizing a lot. And so please, please, please read your book to get the best and first detail. If you have specific questions that your book can't answer, you don't understand, that's the value of this asynchronous course. Please just reach out to me and we can either work it out in office hours or I can produce a supplementary video to try and help you understand. Okay, 18.2, formation of new species. So by the end of this section, you're going to be able to do the following. You're going to define species and describe how scientists identify species as different from each other. You're going to be able to talk about the genetic variables that lead to speciation. You're going to talk about pre-zygotic and post-zygotic reproductive barriers. The zygote is the actual reproduced embryo, right? So pre-zygotic would be before an embryo is formed. Post-zygotic would be after an embryo is formed. You're going to be able to explain allopatric and sympatric speciation and also describe adaptive radiation. It sounds like a lot. Some of these terms are scary, but I promise we'll get through it. So a species, just hopping right in to species and their ability to reproduce. A species is a group of individual organisms that interbreed and produce fertile, viable offspring. So there's two things. One, you need to be able to have sex. Two, you need to actually produce offspring that are themselves viable. Different hybrids and species formations all kind of fail these definitions in various ways. So a species is a group of organisms that's interbreeding successfully with each other. So appearance is not always linked to whether or not something can interbreed with something else. Dogs are a great example, right? We have a Chihuahua all the way up to a Burmese mountain dog. They can interbreed with each other. I don't recommend it, especially if the mother is the smaller dog, but it is possible. And that's because dogs are not separate species. They're all part of the same species. Canis lupus familiaris. And so even though they look very dramatically different, they are able to interbreed. And then we have the other case where individuals might appear similar, but they're not members of the same species. I love to go to birds for this because a lot of birds to me look the same. They just do. I'm sorry, birders. That's just the way it is. And so, you might have two hawks, like the red-tailed hawk and the rough-shouldered hawk. I think that's the name of that secondary species. To me, they look exactly the same, but they cannot interbreed with each other, and they do not interbreed with each other because they are separate species. So evolution by natural selection tracks changes in populations through time. Speciation is the process by which populations diverge into new species. And so, we might think about the evolution of mankind, where we came out of various old world primate species, chimps slowly evolving to become more and more human-like. And many of those were actually species along the way. And so the formation of species is how we go from one species to two species. How do they stop breeding with each other? There are two kinds of speciation that we'll talk about. Allopatric involves geographic separation of two populations, and then sympatric means speciation occurring in the same location. So allo means other, sim means similar. Allopatric speciation usually occurs because of a geographic disturbance. So the mountain ranges are a great example of this. So if you have a species that used to be on one side and then a couple of individuals fly to the other side, over time, as they're separated, genetic drift will occur, so their genes will slowly change through mutation and sexual reproduction, and they will be isolated from each other, each adapting to their own environment, and that's how we get the great western owl versus the great eastern owl, to go back to birds. Neither of those are real species, but you get the idea. We have a lot of variation. We'll also have old world, new world, which problematic terms, but that aside, Europe and Asia might have a a pigeon species, and the US might have a different pigeon species. And so same thing, there's a separation, there's a body of water. Somehow a couple of individuals made it to a new place, and then they slowly diverged. And that's actually how Darwin discovered evolution by natural selection, studying the Galapagos Islands and how each island had a different set of finches and species. So allopatric speciation is kind of the most common, easiest to think about. Sympatric speciation is when this kind of happens right on top of each other. And so something you could think about here is like timing of reproduction. So let's say for whatever reason, a subset of individuals started mating later and later in insects, because insects, this does actually happen. So you have like this butterfly, and this butterfly always mates in the spring every year, and then one day it realizes, or a couple of individuals realize, hey, they can mate later in the summer too, because the fall is long enough where they can have a whole other generation. So then you start having one set of individuals that are only reproducing once a year, and then you have another set of individuals that are reproducing twice a year. And for whatever reason, these two, genetically, behaviorally, they're just not communicating anymore. And so even though they're right on top of each other, by timing, you can tell, oh, that's the spring butterfly and this is the fall butterfly. And so that's sympatric speciation, the idea of kind of evolving in the same place because of something that is not geographic or physical. If a population of one species disperses throughout an area and then ends up in isolated habitats and kind of forms new species from that, that's known as adaptive radiation. And that is what Darwin saw in the Galapagos Islands. So, the founder species might have had like one beak type, and then a couple of individuals made it to the next island and their beaks became shorter to crunch the big seeds. And then others went to another island and something else happened, and that's adaptive radiation. Let me make sure here. Okay. Reproductive isolation. So one thing that's key for speciation is this concept of reproductive isolation. So reproductive isolation is when species, populations, are reproductively isolated. They are not seeing each other, they're not breeding with each other, and that is really what reinforces speciation. Reproductive isolation doesn't need to be physical, like the example I gave. It can also be kind of that sympatric, similar situation, different circumstances sort of deal. So a prezygotic barrier to that end, I spoke about this briefly, is something that happens before reproduction that could block reproduction from taking place. So this could be in ducks, penis size and shape are a real thing that are a prezygotic barrier between species. It could be some sort of behavior as well, or the bird's not doing the song right, so the other females won't mate with it. A post-zygotic barrier occurs after zygote formation, and this is usually some sort of developmental failure. So the offspring doesn't form right, or if it does form, it is sterile. We see sterile individuals in domestic cats, actually. Occasionally, male tortoiseshell cats, those are the black and tan and orange kind of rusty cats. If male tortoiseshell cats exist, they are very often sterile because it is a post-zygotic barrier, and they actually usually have an extra chromosome. Other prezygotic barriers are called, say, temporal isolation, which has to do with time, or behavioral or habitat isolation. All these things can kind of prevent reproduction. And when you're preventing reproduction between two populations, eventually you may get new species. All right, that's it for 18.2.